I think I expect that people are gonna start coming in, or continue coming in for a while, but I think it's a good time to go ahead. So I want to open up to some of the questions that we got, and I want to start with Teresa has I guess her hand's been up for the longest from the beginning. So Christina, if you want to get her hand, yeah, perfect.
So Teresa, I've allowed you to talk, so if you'd like to unmute yourself and say anything, otherwise we can move on to the next question.
Okay, well, let her, maybe if she's trying to figure that out, then we're gonna move on to the next question and we can come back. So another question that we got was about the budget. What is an idea of what does expensive mean? And I think that's a really broad, I mean, it just brings up the question for all of this, what does everything cost and what kind of budget should people have in mind? And, you know, do you have any guidance for someone as far as what kind of budget they might expect? So Todd, have you thought about, or is there any kind of guidance as far as what kind of costs you might expect for strategic discovery?
Yeah, I think it's something that can be scaled and adapted to individual needs. The most expensive thing would be to invest a lot in developing a product without having thought it through beforehand, kind of where are you headed? So I think, with that in mind, whatever you can afford at the beginning, it's worth spending. So, in our examples, I think as little as a week, if you had a concept that you already had kind of in mind, you want to validate, like, hey, this makes sense, and just sort of come out with some of the really big questions about, is there a market here, or would the users be ready to accept something like this? You could spend a week doing some research like that and get some pretty good answers. If you're looking at, kind of an open space and you're thinking, we want to pull together a list of 20 really well-validated needs that we could do some brainstorming on and try to figure out which one we think is really the best fit for our business. There you might be looking at a couple of months of having a team of people, go and do all that work. That's probably the simplest answer I have for it.
Okay, so I mean, maybe that's somewhere in the $5,000 to $50,000. I don't know.
Yeah.
But for product development, I think from the idea of going from concept to prototype to design for manufacturing, the budget can range wildly based on whether it's a regulated medical device, whether it has electronics in it, whether it's large and has a really large tooling costs. So you could run the gamut between, $100,000 to $200,000 up to a few $1,000,000, depending on what kind of product and what requirements are in the R&D space. I don't think it gets into the pharmaceutical sort of budgets that take multiple years and hundreds of people, but for developing sort of the idea of what is expensive in product development, I mean, I think expensive is in the millions, and certainly that is complicated. A class 3 pacemaker is going to be very expensive. It's going to be more than that. I think everyone would agree with that. But I think there's a wide range of development, and that's why I think in the product development I talked about doing things in a stage gate approach where you can do them efficiently and low cost, because you're always thinking about making the decision to move forward, to keep spending money or to keep gathering money. So either way, whether you're getting investor funds or grant funding, you want to create a set of milestones so that when you hit that milestone, you've decided for yourself, okay, I'm willing, this is good news, I'm willing to put in another big chunk of change, whether it's my own money, whether it's I'm going to get an investor and they're going to put in money, whether I'm going to apply to a grant because people reviewing them have to also be convinced. So I'm thinking about the expense of the product development process in stages. So that was another question that we had was, what's the, it looks like it was, oh, I guess that's answered it. But what is the way, let me see, there was a,
Are you referring to the answered question
maybe, I saw a question that was about,
about the
was the-
FDA?
Yeah,
Okay.
so there's a question, what's the balance between prototyping your device and testing feasibility and actually developing your products?
yeah.
So that, that's a really great question, and I'm just going to quickly jump in with a regulatory perspective here. So sometimes you get really lucky and your early prototype, everything works and you can take it far. So our company, Ablative Solutions, had a catheter that went into the renal artery. 3 little microneedles came out and you injected alcohol, which knocked out the nerves in the adventitia of the renal arteries. And on prototype design number 3, it worked. And we went into animals, and our initial animal studies, it worked. And we wound up taking that product into our first in human, and we wrote, it was an IND because it was a combination product and regulated as a device. So, but usually it doesn't. So, if you can do a feasibility study where you're just down and dirty and getting the information and you're planning on iterating, you want to do that in the cheapest manner possible. When you get up to your studies that are going to go into humans, you need to use what's called GLP, good laboratory practice, animal studies. And those are very expensive. On order 5 times more expensive than the same animal study in a non-GLP setting, even if you're doing it at the same facility that has both GLP and non-GLP. So you need to be very strategic. If you think this is a version that is really, you're going to learn from these studies and you're going to iterate and keep, working on the design or some of the features, then you want to do it in the lowest cost process. And, what becomes a feasibility study sometimes becomes your pivotal study. So again, the answer is, it all depends, and sometimes you get lucky and you seize on the proper features early. So it's hard to define. But remember, prototyping, when you're redoing your V5 version number 5, you're still kind of prototyping. So these terms can be used lightly.
If I can sort of add to what you all have been talking about, one part of the patent process is something called a provisional patent application. Not everybody uses it, but it's a really good approach because basically it's an application you file before you start making your invention famous and start talking about it. But it's an application you file that's never going to get reviewed. And you have a year before you file the formal application. And during that time, you're doing your feasibility studies or your studies, you're doing your prototyping, you're collecting all that information. You have to put as much as you possibly can in my mind, in the provisional, so it covers what's ultimately in what's called the non-provisional. But again, your fine tuning and all that goes on during that year between provisional and non-provisional. So it's really a great tool to use if this is part of your process.
And one more thing that I can add is too, as you change your process, ultimately you have to have a full body of testing to go into humans or to get it cleared or approved by FDA. And if you've done different types of testing on the bench or in animals or in humans on different versions of your product, if you can keep your version control, you may be able to leverage some of those earlier tests by saying, well, the changes were minor, it didn't affect it. And so those earlier tests are still relevant, and then you don't have to redo it. So that's another piece to keeping your documentation and understanding what changes you've made over time, what testing you've done, the rigor you've done at each level of testing, and what's required at the end. Sometimes you can have that conversation with FDA and say, hey, look, we did this really rigorous testing, even though it was an earlier version. Is this good enough? Do we have to repeat this $100,000 test or something? So.
And from a product development perspective, the clinical studies are often centered around efficacy or how well the device performs when it's with a patient. Whereas a lot of the other testing that goes into it is safety related. So does it perform at different temperatures? Does it perform, if you have accuracy requirements, does it hit that accuracy requirement, and does it do it under any condition that you could see it? Is it outdoor in the Sahara Desert? Is it indoor in a hospital? Is it used outdoor in Minnesota? So it depends on what type of testing or performance, but you wouldn't do those kind of tests in a clinical study environment. You would do the clinical study and show that it works, and then prove that it is safe and validating that all the performance goals are met by your device itself. And those can be done individually or together. Some are non-destructive, some are destructive, and you create basically a protocol and a plan for your verification and validation process. Okay, so what are some of the risks of not using a non-disclosure agreement? Eric, you had talked about an NDA, and sometimes people will come to me and say they want to use an NDA, and so we will work under an NDA, but I've heard that a lot of people don't necessarily want to entertain ideas under an NDA. What are some of the consequences of talking about it without an NDA?
It's a great question, and there's several. Like I said earlier, one of the benefits of the NDA is you're providing a framework for having discussions about sensitive information. If you have information that is a trade secret or that is competitive advantage to you that you don't want to get out into the public domain or into the public realm, or to be used without restriction, not having an NDA can have the consequence of giving a lot more latitude in terms of being able to use your sensitive materials. The benefit is it provides that closed room, so to speak, a virtual closed room in which you can talk. But even taking that into account, I mean, there's several organizations and others that sometimes will take the approach that anything you say to us is not secret. If you share it with us, we are going to go forward on the basis that anything you share with us, we can use freely. Sometimes not being willing to sign an NDA is a signal that that's the culture, that's the attitude, that's the approach that an organization like that may take. From an asset protection standpoint, then if you don't have an NDA, the short answer as a practical matter is you have to be very, very careful as to what you're going to share. Because as a legal matter, and I think we spoke about this earlier, there's an argument that you may not be providing the protections to retain your rights in the information that you share that way. But again, the difficulty, I would say some companies that aren't willing may not be nefarious, but sometimes they're presented with an NDA literally at the table when they're about to begin the discussion. And they say, you know what, I'm not comfortable signing a legal document right before I'm going to begin having discussions. I need time to digest this as a practical matter. NDAs are something that should be discussed early, should be discussed in the context of how do we protect each other, and then make sure that there's enough time that everybody gets comfortable with the idea and determine if you can get comfortable with it.
Yeah, sometimes we might not want to sign an NDA with a vendor because we don't want them to divulge something to us that then we're therefore obligated to. If we've been working on something, we might already know various things in that space, but we don't want to get their we don't want to be obligated, and so we just don't want them to tell us their IP. Whatever is secret, just leave that part out of the conversation. We don't need to know it. We don't want to know it. It obligates us. That sometimes happens. So it's not nefarious. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to go steal that, but I'm trying to avoid an entanglement. Now, from an IP perspective, Linda, what are your thoughts on the NDA? Aren't there ramifications for that?
Yeah, I mean, the publicly disclosing your invention starts a clock. And if you want to get patent protection for an invention, you have to file a patent application within a year of that time. If you share, if you are under, if you don't have an NDA and you're sharing information and that becomes public, you've started the clock without really even meaning to. All of a sudden, you've done these public disclosures. Also, when you're not working with an NDA and someone takes your idea, I mean, that kind of falls in the nefarious thing. But if, you know, someone takes your idea, our patent system is not set up based on who is the first to invent. Our patent system is set up based on who's the first to file. So whoever files the patent application is the one who's moving forward with the process. Now, that person has to identify all of the inventors. And if I was in a conversation with you, I file a patent application based on what you and I talked about, I'm going to put both of our names on, but I'll be the applicant. So I kind of own the thing, and I just have to somehow convince you to assign your rights to me. But that puts me in a little bit of a place of control. But again, I have to convince you to assign your rights to me. So again, the clock is one of them, but also has to do with the first to file. The first to file system is another issue with non-disclosure agreements.
One thing that comes up very frequently is if your goal is to build to sell or to get acquired, you need to talk to these big companies. If you're a small startup with limited resources and they do steal your idea, the chances of you successfully, litigating that are probably small. I had a really interesting conversation about just that with somebody from one of the large OEMs, and they said, look, the second we get accused of stealing an inventor's ideas, nobody comes to us with innovations anymore, and our pipeline is shut off. So the companies, the ethical ones, are really rigorous about documenting and then having a track record of not doing this. That said, as the inventor, you really need to protect yourself and make sure that you're monitoring these interactions and make sure that what you discuss doesn't then get used.
Todd, do you want to answer Nolan's question? So Nolan asks, how much should the strength of the competition play into the initial business risk calculation?
Yeah, I'm reading the rest of this question here. Yeah, I think, if there's established competition, that cuts both ways. It means that there's a bit of an uphill battle for you. There may be a more narrow space in terms of the technology you could use because maybe there's existing IP. It means that those competitors may be looking at what you do and trying to innovate, to stay ahead of you. But at the same time, with competition in the space, it means that there's a market. So it's already kind of been validated for you. So it means, there's a real need there. People are willing to pay for a solution. So I think you can approach it a couple of different ways. One might be to try to develop relationships with the competitors, with those strategic firms, and try to understand, what innovations would they be looking for? Because I don't know the breakdown, but a pretty decent chunk of what like large medtech firms have on the market comes through acquisition. So they are looking for this. So as a startup, in that case, you're not necessarily looking to get out there and have to build the entire business, develop your sales force, and get to sales. It might be enough to kind of develop the technology and having a relationship, a careful one with NDAs and such in place, but developing a relationship with those competitors might be a way for you to understand what development milestones would you need to hit to make yourself a good acquisition target.
So building on that from a regulatory perspective, there's a huge second mover advantage. So if you've got something really novel, you're either thinking of yourself and then, by yourself, how you're going to test this and develop it, and then negotiating with FDA if you're really novel and really what you've got to do. And there may be some trials and tribulations. There are many examples of really well-designed clinical trials that just failed in certain areas because of unknowns. So if there's a product on the market, whatever they did, that's what you've got to do most likely. If it's mature technology, you may be able to make an argument through the pre-submission, be a great way to do it. With FDA, have that discussion. Look, we know what these trials are like now. Can I do a lesser trial or do less testing because this is more mature? So on the one hand, for the market, you need to show how differentiated and how novel you are. Todd's point was great. If there's a monstrous market, there's room for many players and there may be feature sets that differentiate you. But from regulatory, you want to show how similar you are because you're de-risked. So another thing to think about in your approaches.
Right, the predicate device, making the pathway a lot easier. So Linda, we have a question. Do you have a year after public disclosure in the rest of the world for patenting, and compared to what he thought was just a year only in the US?
Yeah, you're correct. It's a year in the US. I think Canada has a grace period as well, but everywhere else, as soon as you make a public disclosure, you have to file the application that day, or you've missed your opportunity to obtain patent protection.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question if anybody was waiting on one. Okay. Well, I think I am going to take the opportunity to thank all of our panelists and really appreciate you joining me on this. This was awesome. And if there are any, we're going to post this online so we can share. And if anybody didn't have an opportunity to make it, then we can share that link. And I am really excited about doing something else that might be around a business from a different perspective. So thinking about building a business, there's a lot of opportunities out there and everybody has unique perspectives on what their business might look like and their product might look like. And that's the amazing thing about everyone having different perspectives. So, I think there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of great things about building a business. And so, this was a lot of fun. I'm really excited. So thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us, to all the people who attended, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.